Well, good evening. Our debate topic for tonight is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Christian and Muslim perspectives. I think we are honored and in for a treat for our two debaters that we have here tonight. A weakness that's often seen in debates is that one side or the other understands their own position very well, but doesn't necessarily understand in any complete sense the other individual's position.
Could it be that the Quran simply isn't clear enough in what it says about Jesus' crucifixion? And this would bring us to the third point of agreement. Shabir and I agree that Surah 4, verse 157 of the Quran is extremely vague and confusing.
Acts of the Apostles did not write down precisely what the disciples preached. The author wrote down the kinds of things which he thought it would have been natural for the disciples to preach. So
we now enter the crossfire portion. We will basically be trading back 2 minutes back and forth between each debater to interact with each other. For those who are fans of Dr. Ally and Dr. Wood, you've seen this before. And so without any further ado, I'm sorry.
I was just wondering if the timer could sit somewhere where we could sort of talk to each other but still see him. Is there somewhere close?
Yeah, if somebody here in the middle doesn't mind trading, that's very generous of you. Thank you very much. We'll start with Dr. Wood, your first 2 minutes.
Yeah, Shabir, you've been presenting some theories of some scholars. So let's say that Acts was written around 115 AD. Now that is, of course, by the sort of next generation of the Jesus seminar that put forth that theory. And the vast majority of scholars would put Acts much earlier. And so you're going with the most critical scholars you can find when it comes to the book of Acts. And I'm wondering if these scholars who are putting forward various skeptical theories and looking for evolutions and so on, how would they think of Jesus as portrayed in the Quran and whether the Quran is an embellishment? So the birth narrative of Jesus, we know that this goes back to the Arabic infancy gospel, and it gets changed in the Quran. We find all kinds of stories that we can find earlier. Dul Qarnayn, finding the place where the sun sets. We know where this comes from. It comes from the Alexander romances and the glorious deeds of Alexander. The sleepers in the cave who sleep for 300 years and wake up. We know where this story comes from. It goes back to Bishop Stephen of Ephesus. And so if Muhammad is repeatedly accused over and over and over again in the Quran of plagiarizing other sources, so we know this is an accusation in his time, and people are pointing at him saying, you're copying these tales of the ancients over and over. It's tales of the ancients. You're copying fables of the men of old. When you're talking about Jesus, when you're talking about the stories of Mary, we know where these stories come from. We have actual documents. The question is, how do you think the same kinds of scholars, like the Jesus Seminar, if they were to go to the Quran and evaluate its contents on historical matters, do you think they'd accept them, or do you think they would say this is obviously not historical?
Well, I would start by saying that these are skeptical and critical scholars, and they're skeptical of all faiths, not only of Christianity, but of Islam and of other religions as well. They tend to treat these religions as made up by human beings for good reasons, perhaps. So I wouldn't expect them to say that the Quran is the word of God and the Quranic narrative is true. In any case, I do not regard the Quranic narrative as a historical description of what has happened in the past. The Quranic narrative has a very important purpose of drawing lessons from literature and from history. So when the Quran speaks about events or what is known from previous literature, the Quran is telling people, think about this story, think about what you know about this, and then what should you conclude from that? And it's the Quranic conclusion that is being driven home. What is important in our dialogue tonight is to recognize that the scholars that we're referring to here are actually scholars who are steeped in Christian studies. They have studied the Bible in detail, and they're mentioning this. So previously I mentioned Marcus Borg. Marcus Borg is one of those who say that the Acts of the Apostles was written in the 2nd century. And that places the Acts of the Apostles late. And there are other scholars, and many scholars who have actually put their heads together. The Jesus Seminar has actually produced a book on this entitled Acts and Christian Beginnings, after they have deliberated over this, just as they have put out a book on what were the actual sayings of Jesus and the acts of Jesus, a book that you have cited in the article that you wrote. So these are the scholars. Some of them may now be agnostics. Some of them may even be atheists, maybe closet atheists. But nonetheless, they start with the Christian understanding and they see all of the problems, and now they come back with agnosticism and atheism.
In case the audience doesn't know about the Jesus Seminar, you have conservative scholars, you have liberal scholars, you have scholars of all kinds of different theological backgrounds. Just to give you an idea, if this were a political spectrum and not a theological spectrum, the Jesus Seminar would be so far to the left they would be neo-Nazis. Now, I'm not saying they're neo-Nazis. They're some very nice gentlemen. I'm saying that that's how far off the level, off the spectrum they are. And when you go to these kinds of scholars to get your view of Acts, and then ignore people I would say are much more centered. So, for instance, A.N. Sherwin White said, "For Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted." So why would we go with the most extreme view of Acts we can find? And notice, I didn't appeal to Acts. I appealed to much earlier material. So if this is our approach, think about what we're doing here. If you're going to the most radical skeptics you can find, like the Jesus Seminar, to get your view of the text, if you applied that same level, the same types of people to the Muslim sources, and we have people like this. Muhammad Sven Kalish was a Muslim scholar in Germany. He noticed that the methods he was applying to the Bible, he wasn't applying to the Muslim sources. He decided to apply that method to the Muslim sources, and he walked away and said, Muhammad probably never existed. I don't agree with him, but that's what happens when you apply these methods to Muslim sources.
Yeah, so I have nothing against Sven Kalish if he understands the Muslim history well enough and he's able to make pronouncements of the same critical kind that are being made against the Bible. But it seems that Sven Kalish did not understand Muslim history well enough for him to make that radical pronouncement that Muhammad did not exist, or probably did not exist. And that's why other scholars have not picked up on him. He has actually fallen on the wayside. We don't have other people building on his work, taking it further. What we have in all of the religions is that you have a conservative scholarship that tries to hold on to everything that we have traditionally held on to. And then there are others who tease the boundaries of that tradition. And over time, what has happened in Christianity is that those who tease the boundaries have actually broken the boundaries, and they have given good evidence for why they're doing this. And the evidence is there. You don't have to be a conservative scholar to see the kind of evidence that I put before you. You can see that there's a development, that there's a change. From one man to an angel to two angels, there's a definite change. And more than this, when you read the Gospels, you will see that in the Gospel of Mark, the women bought spices thinking that they will come to anoint the body of Jesus. Only on their way, they're wondering, how are we going to roll the stone back? Now, if guards were at the tomb, this is not even a question. So Matthew has guards at the tomb, not Mark. So Matthew's guards at the tomb is an obvious invention. And that's not the only invention, but Matthew says that at the time when Jesus died on the cross, the bodies of the saints were resurrected, and later on they came out and went into the city and met where they were seen by many people. So you must imagine there were hundreds of saints walking around Jerusalem within those days. Now, is this believable, or is this Matthew's invention? This is obviously Matthew's invention. You don't have to be a scholar to see that. You say that we don't have people agreeing with someone like Muhammad Sven Kalish, and so he's fallen off the edge. Well, I mean, you're citing someone like Dieter Zeller giving an obscure interpretation of the sign of Jonah in a hypothetical document. So it's speculation upon speculation upon speculation. Who agrees with this? Well, it certainly hasn't caught on, and so
By the same token, you shouldn't be quoting this. And if you are going to go with someone with people like that, then by all means we can conclude that Muhammad never existed. Again, I'm not adhering to that position. I'm saying if you find the people who are at the extremes and go with their views, you end up with that sort of thing. Now, take something like one angel instead of, two angels and one angel and so on. Think about this. If you were to walk out tonight and someone says, what did you do? I went and saw Shabir Ally. And then later on, someone else asks you, what did you do? I was watching David Wood and Shabir Ally. Well, there, you've embellished your story, you've got a contradiction. That's just not the case. Different writers can write different things for different purposes. If you say Matthew clearly invents the guard story because others don't mention it, well, that's an argument from silence. If this person doesn't mention it, then this other person invented it. And we just don't use that anywhere if we're not applying it to the Gospels. And so again, if we take this same method, it says it here, but it doesn't say it here, and we were to apply that to the Muslim sources, you could conclude that Muhammad probably never existed. Because, think about this. Shabir's calling into question documents that even according to his dates, are several decades after the events. Well, the sources that Muslims use start with Ibn Ishaq at more than a century after the events they report, and that's your earliest detailed biographical source that you use. And Muslims say, don't believe that, it's corrupted. You have to go with later sources, Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, 2 centuries after the time of Muhammad.
What is interesting is that what the Quran is actually driving at is an early Christian belief, pre-gospel, something that Christian scholars are now reconstructing from the pre-Markan Passion narrative and from the Gospel Q that became a source for Matthew and Luke. And David is asking, well, why go with Dieter Zeller? He's also fallen off to the wayside. No, he hasn't actually, because his writings have been picked up by Daniel Smith, and Daniel Smith's work, his book is actually a revision of his PhD thesis done at the University of Toronto. So this is serious work. And then Daniel Smith published another book entitled Revisiting the Empty Tomb. And John Kloppenborg, who is a premier scholar on the Q Gospel today, in his book entitled Q, the Earliest Gospel, has actually picked up on the same idea that Jesus, according to the Q Gospel, must have been assumed into heaven. The term that the academics use is assumption, that Jesus was taken up, ruptured, translated, transported somehow into heaven from the tomb itself. So whereas Christians have it that Jesus came out of the tomb, met with his disciples, and then was ascended, the Quran goes straight from the statement about crucifixion to the statement about ascension. So there's no in-between. And the Quran is essentially right according to the reconstruction of these Christian scholars. They're not often the wayside scholars. They are serious scholars who have built on previous scholarship, and they're showing us the actual discrepancies which are there. It's not simple things like 1 angel, 2 angels. Who cares if there are 40 angels or 45? But you can see a development in the story, and then there are more serious ones. It's not just that somebody did not mention something, it's somebody does not leave room for some possibility of something. For example, in John's Gospel, Jesus was already wrapped in spices, and the women were observers of this. So how did they go about buying spices thinking that they'll spice up the body of Jesus? So it's 2 different narratives in 2 different Gospels. They're way contradictory. There's no way of reconciling them.
You say that the Quran is driving at an earlier source, a pre-Christian source. I could point out the obvious and say that according to Surah 7, verse 157 of the Quran, people were still reading the Gospel in the 7th century. It refers to those who are reading the Gospel. So that means that the Gospel was there in the 7th century and that it had been preserved through the 6th century, the 5th century, the 4th century, the 3rd century, the 2nd century from the 1st century. If you're then saying that the Quran is arguing for some pre-Christian source that we no longer have, we don't have it, then this is just incoherent. You say that the Quran is driving for this earlier source, but what the Quran says about Jesus, Jesus speaking as a baby, Mary giving birth under a palm tree, Jesus giving life to clay birds, we know where these stories come from, and they come from far after the New Testament Gospels. So if the Quran is striving for this early source, it's doing a really, really poor job of it and going in the total wrong opposite direction. Now, again, if you were to go to the method that scholars would use, the kinds of scholars you would cite to evaluate the Bible, if they were to look at these claims about Jesus and they would look at the sources and see where they came from and see how Muhammad embellished these stories, because these weren't Islamic stories. The details are changed to give an Islamic perspective. That's exactly how Shabir is saying we can't trust the New Testament. So obviously, according to the same methodology, we can't trust the Quran by any means. And again, Muhammad is being accused over and over again of plagiarizing sources. So if we know he's being accused and we know the people are familiar with where he's getting these sources, then according to Shabir's methodology, we all have to reject the Quran. Or he doesn't believe that's a good methodology, in which case there goes his argument against the Bible.
We have to recall that our topic tonight is not, is the Quran the Word of God? I didn't come out here tonight to convince Christians that they should follow the Quran and that should take the Quran as being an accurate and true book of God. But what I'm saying to our Christian friends and to Muslims tonight is to think about the fact that serious Christian scholarship is arriving at an early Christian belief that Jesus was assumed from the tomb. And some are even saying that he was assumed alive if we take the sign of Jonah seriously, because Jonah was in the whale of the fish and he was preserved alive by God, and that became a miracle for all of us. So if Jesus was in the womb of the tomb and he was then taken out alive without dying in the first place, then that seems similar to the sign of Jonah. This is what Dieter Zeller was driving at. And I'm saying to Christians and Muslims, think about the fact that what Christian scholars are arriving at now through their independent study having nothing to do with the Quran, think about the fact that that coincides with something that the Quran actually says. Now, it is true that some things that the Quran says are not going to be suitable to Christians because they don't find those in their Gospels, and they think that these come from apocryphal sources. Why should we trust that? But I've explained, and you've heard me, so there's no need to repeat, but because David has raised the question again, the point is this: the Quran is referring to what people already know. It's like if we say to you, remember how this Hulk guy was, when he was a human, he went around shopping for stretchable underwear, and knowing obviously he'll need that when the moment occurs. So then somebody who doesn't know what we're talking about will think we're referring to actual persons, but you know that we're referring to a person in a movie or in a Marvel Comics description. In a similar way, when the Quran is talking about Jesus in a particular way, it could be something based on history, it could be something based on the previous literature. It's calling the attention of the people to the story and drawing out the Quranic lessons.
Now, did you catch that? Did you just catch Shabir comparing stories in the Quran about people like Jesus and so on to, maybe it's just talking about, as you and I would talk about, the Hulk or something like that, Marvel heroes. Well, if that's the case, then when the Quran tells us that the Jews thought they killed him, but they killed him not nor crucified him, maybe this is just a kind of comic book story that we're not supposed to take seriously. Shabir points out that this debate isn't about whether we should follow Islam. I agree. It is the Christian and Muslim perspectives. And if we have the Christian and Muslim perspectives, we're looking for sort of a coherent view. And if we have methods, if we adopt methods, as we're examining a text, and those exact same methods, if we turned those on our own sources, would wreak absolute havoc and lead to conclusions that we would never accept, then we should probably be looking for a better methodology. And so, looking at what the Quran says, if it tells Christians to judge by the gospel, and you're saying that that's not inconsistent with corruption. Well, just a few verses earlier in chapter 5, verse 43, where Jews come to Muhammad to settle a dispute, Allah answers, why do they come to you for judgment when they have the Torah? Now, if they have a corrupt book, they obviously need Muhammad. But they don't need to go to Muhammad because they have the Torah. And so if Allah is saying that he's going to aid the true followers of Jesus until they become uppermost, and what that really means is he's going to let them, everything they do be corrupted, and we won't even have any records of it except for a speculation by Dieter Zeller. And judge by the gospel means judge by something else. I just don't know how we can take this book seriously.
Well, I would maintain that we can take the Quran seriously when the Quran is saying judge by what God has revealed therein. David has actually given a context which belies the very point that he was making, because the context that he describes shows that the Quran is as telling the Jews to judge by their law in their book and telling the Christians to judge by their law in their book. It's not speaking about all of theological statements that are found in either the Old Testament or the New Testament. And in fact, the Quran is very clear that just as we have shown that there was a development in the resurrection narratives in the Gospels, it can similarly be demonstrated that there's a development in the theology among these Gospels, making Jesus bigger and greater the later the Gospel, especially so in the Gospel according to John. So when the Quran is saying to Christians, judge by that which God has revealed therein, it's not by all of the book, but you have to look at what specifically God has revealed vis-a-vis what other people have added and changed into the Gospels. And if David is shocked by my mention of the Hulk story, well, think about the fact that the Quran is not representing itself as a historical narrative. The Quran is not saying, okay, in the reign of such a king, and this was the year, and this is the history. The Quran is drawing out lessons. But the Gospels are representing themselves as history. And when Matthew tells us that all these saints came back to life and they appeared to the people in Jerusalem, he's actually describing history. And since most Christians today would take this to be not history, Christians have a serious problem with their own book. And the gospel narratives are shown to be developing and inventing the stories. Think about Thomas touching Jesus in John's gospel. Now, in Luke's gospel, Jesus appeared to the 11, which means that Thomas was there. But John split the narrative into two, making Thomas absent, in which case Jesus would have only appeared to 10. To leave Thomas for a week later when he can touch the wound of Jesus. So this is invention right before our very eyes.
We'll now move to 5-minute closing statements by each debater. And for those that are thinking of questions, please, again, formulate your questions as you're thinking of them in 30-second snips. Our first closing statement.
Now, Shabir said that when the Quran commands Christians to judge by the gospel, to judge by what Allah hath revealed therein, if Allah really meant to Christians who he had already told still had the gospel in the 7th century, if what he meant was, you're going to have to wait a really long time until some scholars come along who are going to be able to pick these gospels apart, and they're going to be able to tell you what's in these pre-Christian sources that you don't have. And so then you could know about Q and pre-Mark and a bunch of other sources that we just don't have. Do you seriously think that that's what Allah was saying there? I don't see how. If that's what Allah meant, then he's completely unclear. If Allah says that he aided the true followers of Jesus until they became uppermost, and what that really means is that Allah, he tried to help them a little bit, but they became corrupted, and other people proclaiming Jesus' death, resurrection, and deity, they took over. If that's what Allah meant, then he's not a very good communicator, because even Muslim scholars, Yusuf Ali, you can look up his commentary right there in that study Quran. Yusuf Ali says that this refers to Christians permeating the Roman Empire and becoming uppermost. So Allah is saying, I helped the true Christians until they became uppermost. This is leading even Muslims to conclude that the true followers of Jesus were uppermost. And that's exactly what you would conclude by reading the verse. You wouldn't think, oh, he really means that Christianity was corrupted very early on, and even though Allah promised to aid them, he just didn't. Now, notice what's happened here, right? Shabir has thrown all kinds of skeptical critiques at the Gospels, quoted various scholars and so on. Guess what? If you're not on the most extreme fringe, everyone still grants what I said in my opening statement. Everyone, scholars across the board, still grant that Jesus died by crucifixion. Remember, they didn't say we might know this. They said it's indisputable. That's the position of the same scholars who would say, look at this evolutionary development in the Gospels. Those same scholars conclude we know that Jesus died with absolute certainty, and that his disciples were thoroughly convinced that he had appeared to them. So the same critical scholars conclude exactly the facts that I use to show that Jesus rose from the dead. Which means that if you go further than them, right, if you're appealing to their works, but then you go vastly beyond them and say, what this really shows is that Jesus didn't die by crucifixion, his disciples never believed that he had appeared to them risen from the dead, then you're beyond the most radical, critical scholars. And I think I have kind of a principle here. If in order to reject something, if in order to reject some belief, you are forced to adopt the most radical skeptical theories in order to reject something. Because again, right, you can argue that, there was development in the Gospels and so on. You can argue that. There are mainstream scholars who argue that. But in order to say, therefore Jesus didn't die, therefore Jesus' disciples didn't believe he appeared to them, now you've gone so far beyond anything mainstream, we have to wonder why you would do that. So as a rule, if rejecting something forces you to adopt a methodology that is far, far away from mainstream, a methodology which would never allow your own text or your own beliefs to survive criticism, perhaps you need to stop rejecting the conclusion, right? Perhaps it's time to say, well, if the only way I can get away from this conclusion is to adopt this methodology, maybe I need a new methodology. And so think about how easy this is. Jesus died on the cross. Jesus rose from the dead. That's what Mark says. That's what Matthew says. That's what Luke says. That's what John says. That's what Paul says. That's what the next generation of Christian leaders said, right? People who knew Peter and John said that their message was Jesus' death and resurrection. If that was not true, why didn't they correct it? And so all we know all along is a constant affirmation of Jesus' death and resurrection. And if you look at that and conclude, no death, no resurrection, I think you need a new methodology.
Coming now to our final statements, folks, I want to not forget where we began. I wanted to find ways in which Muslims and Christians can talk to each other and to leave here as friends at the end of the night. I didn't come out here to prove Christianity wrong, but I was hoping to reach back with Christian scholars for the earliest Christian proclamations, the earliest forms of Christianity, which my suspicion is would be very close to Islam and would be right. And in doing so, I have cited some scholars, and David is asking, well, how do you take those scholars? Because those scholars deny so much and deny Islam as well. Yeah, I acknowledge these scholars deny Islam as well. Muslims believe that God raised Jesus to heaven. They would deny that. Some would say if you think of Jesus going up physically, well, if he goes straight up, he would be in orbit. Maybe he'll land on the moon or on Mars or something like this. So a Muslim would say, well, I have faith in God. Somehow God has done this. I don't know how. I don't understand the astronomy, but everything is within the power of God. So we depart from those radical, skeptical scholars when we come to our specific faith proclamations. But we want to proclaim things that the scholarship would not prove to be wrong. They might have their own suspicions and say God does not exist and therefore God never sanctioned Jesus in the first place. And Muslims would say God existed and God sanctioned Jesus and God vindicated Jesus, though we don't think that he actually died on the cross, but God vindicated him by raising him either from the tomb or in some other way that we don't know, but God raised him and he's in heaven. Others will say, but there is no heaven. So we don't take them for their skepticism, but we take them for their serious scholarship when they're looking at the history, they're looking at texts, and they're telling us what their position is as a basis. So then we can build our faith on that historical basis and foundation. And David is right that these scholars widely acknowledge that Jesus died on the cross. Not so much for the reasons that David mentioned, but for the criterion of embarrassment. They say that Christians would not have invented the story if they didn't think it was true. They wouldn't have reported it. And since Christians widely reported that Jesus died on the cross, which was an embarrassment for them, it must be taken as true. Not because the whip was like this and so on, because nobody knows the details that actually transpired in the case of Jesus himself. And David says, well, we're relying on Roman and other historians. Josephus himself, the Jewish historian from the time, says about one of his friends who was hanging on a cross, and he used his influence to get him down and given medical treatment, and the one of the three friends actually survived. So crucifixion does not immediately kill a person, and the question was, how did Jesus die so soon? So the Christian the skeptical scholarship nonetheless acknowledges that Jesus died on the cross. Why? Because they think that this was the natural course of events. But E.P. Sanders, in his book on Paul, raises a very important point. He says that today, when we hear that Jesus was out walking around and meeting with his disciples and eating fish, we would wonder, how do you know he really died in the first place? And that's my question tonight. You see, if these critical scholars, they discount all of these narratives. They wouldn't accept that Jesus came out and met his disciples and walked and ate fish and was touched and felt and so on. So they discount that, and they say, well, he really did die. And if he did appear, well, maybe in the imagination of the disciples and not really so. There would be nothing there. If you had a video camera, you wouldn't get anything on the video. So they think they saw something, and we believe them, but it's not a reality. That's their position. But I'm saying, if you take the Gospels, at least in some level of seriousness, and you discount some obvious embellishments, if you have as the basic core that Jesus did come back to life, and he was there with his disciples, how do you know he was dead in the first place? What was the actual proof of his death? And there's no such proof. Only some inventions like the spear thrust in his side. And when we know that, we go back to the scholarship that is digging deeper and finding now, as Daniel Smith has found, that there was an earlier Christian proclamation that Jesus was actually assumed from the tomb. He didn't actually come out and meet with his disciples in the way described in the Gospels. And that assumption from the tomb seems to correspond to what the Quran said. Bal rafa'ahu Allahu ilayhi, but God raised him to himself. And furthermore, Dieter Zeller had the idea that if you look at the sign of Jonah, that would indicate that Jesus was rescued alive and before death. And that seems to correspond with what Muslims believe to this day. So in short, I believe I've arrived at a position that both Muslims and Christians can feel happy with if Christians are willing to go back to the earliest Christian proclamations. Thank you very much.
Well, a big hand for both of our debaters tonight. They did a great job. It's pleasant to see two people.